I don't know how to describe it other than like a demon type of sound.
But it's silhouetted, hulking, every bit of 5.5 feet wide, 13 to 14 foot tall, pitch black.
The one thing that ran through my mind when I had this encounter was I don't have a big enough gun.
Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Welcome. This is a collection of 3 stories being brought to you by William Jevning and being narrated by me, Jim Sower. Story number 1. Many Names, Alaska's Bigfoot, 1994. Alaska's Bigfoot. Bigfoot has been reported in several parts of Alaska. The Tlingit Indians of southeastern Alaska call it Kushtaka. The Denina Indians of south-central named it Nint'ina. The Eskimos of southwest Alaska call it Ureuli, or hairy man. John Active, a Yupik storyteller from Bethel, has gathered a large number of accounts told by the Yupik people of southwestern Alaska concerning their encounters with Ureuli. This being was described as standing 10 feet tall, covered with hair, with glowing eyes. Its arms were so long they reached to the creature's ankles. It was said to roam the tundra and cry out its loneliness with a voice resembling that of a loon. Although its appearance terrified the persons confronting it, the Ureuli never harmed anyone, according to the accounts gathered by John Active. However, legendary accounts lore has it that children who disappear while in the woods are transformed into Ureuli. The southeastern Kushtaka has a less benevolent reputation. The natives feared the creature and avoided its habitat. Harry D. Culp described a miner's encounter with the Kushtaka in an account which was later published as The Strangest Story Ever Told. Culp and 3 other prospectors teamed up in 1900 at Wrangell. They sent Charlie, one of the 4, to Thomas Bay to look over a gold prospect, while the others sought grub stakes to pay their expenses. Charlie went about 50 miles up the coast to this location. There, the rains kept him confined to his tent for several days. He then went out, trying to locate the landmarks given to him by an Indian. By chance, he found a gold-flecked quartz ledge and loosened a piece with his gun, breaking his gun stock in the process. As he was taking his bearings, he said, a troop of creatures he called devils that looked like both men and monkeys swarmed after him. These shaggy beasts with long, coarse hair, stinking and covered with sores, pursued him back to his canoe. During the chase, they screamed and scraped his back with long, claw-like fingers. Charlie said he came to in his canoe, which was drifting at sea. He was cold, hungry, and thirsty. He returned to his comrades with nothing but the clothes on his back, his canoe and oars, and the chunk of gold quartz. He declared he had enough of Alaska. In exchange for his passage back to Seattle, he told his tale to the other 3. 2 more of Culp's partners returned to the site of the gold-speckled quartz ledge. Once again, they returned with strange tales of devils. One of the partners was said to have gone mad. Other prospects who have scouted the same area were reported by Culp to have suffered frightening experiences and to have behaved in a strange manner afterwards. Mysterious happenings occurred as late as 1925, when a farmer reported losing a dog in the hills there, but finding strange tracks, with the hind feet resembling a cross between a bear's and a human's footprints. A trapper in the area disappeared. Searchers found his outfit and tracks, but no trace of the man. The Iliamna region not only has a fish monster, but also is a home to Big Man, as the natives call him there, For years, Big Man has been blamed for stealing fish from the villages and for mysterious disappearances of people. More recently, Federal Aviation Administration worker Jim Coffey said an 8-foot humanoid almost ran him off the road in New Halen near Lake Iliamna. That same night, a woman living nearby reported that a Bigfoot left watermelon-sized footprints in her yard and tore down her laundry. Investigators found huge footprints alongside the road. At 24 inches long, they were the largest Bigfoot prints ever found. That's the end of story number 1. Story number 2. Expedition sets out to find unknown creature. The Ucumar? March 2nd, 2003. Expedition sets out to find unknown creature. Mitan, Argentina. Police, backwoodsmen, and firemen seek out strange animal. Rosario de la Frontera footprints found, and strange howls heard. Reinforced by personnel from Mitan, the research team is trying to lock down a wooded area. A team composed of over 20 policemen from Rosario de la Frontera and Mitan, some 15 mounted backwoodsmen, 12 members of the Ciudad Terminal Volunteer Fire Brigade, and journalists from the local TV station El Tribuno and regional broadcasters, is covering every square foot of a densely wooded area where eyewitnesses claim having seen, less than 72 hours ago, the strange humanoid creature that has startled residents of the province's southern reaches. The Ucumar, as the citizenry has incorrectly christened it, would be a 2-meter-tall biped with a hairy body, large claws and ears, and fierce carnivorous habits. The true Ucumar, also known as the spectacled bear, is the only South American plantigrade, but it is herbivorous, easily frightened, and a resident of the tropical rainforests, measuring no more than 1.20 meters. There is no evidence that it exists in the country, although there are specimens in captivity in Bolivia and Ecuador. The operation combing the woods for this strange beast is under the command of Sheriff Rene Tacacho and Jose Ezequiel Alvarez, commander of the Volunteer Fire Brigade and of the Juan Carlos Rivas Archaeological and Paleontological Research Group. The expedition aimed at capturing the strange specimen began on Friday at 2100 hours, without police support, which was incorporated yesterday in the likelihood that the hominid may in fact be prowling the area. The fact is that the participants in the search, unarmed, heard strange howls and found prints that evidenced the recent transit of a heavy, 2-legged animal at around 1 o'clock in the morning. Miguel Moreno, a cameraman for a Rosario television station, said, "At one point, we heard the crackling of leaves and saw a silhouette which vanished quickly into the dense vegetation. Local dogs, a pack of over 30, began barking furiously. One of the hounds," he added, "went after the thing, and we heard it growl in the darkness, but then there was silence, and the dog was never seen again." The search area is located in the vicinity of the municipal garbage dump, 3 kilometers away from the center of the city, where there are trees, overgrown pastures, and all manner of shrubbery. "We were unarmed and did not dare go deeper into the area for fear of an eventual misfortune resulting from an attack," said Jose Ezequiel Alvarez, who requested police support in order to continue. His request was granted yesterday when 20 elements from Rosario de la Frontera, reinforced by personnel from Regional Unit 3, headquartered in Mitan, joined the search. Pepo, one of the firefighters who participated in the first expedition, said, "I'm sure of having seen something resembling a large monkey, although the image was fleeting since it vanished quickly into the dense brush." At the close of this edition, members of the search team were getting ready to quit without having found the key to the door to this mystery, which has kept Rosario residents on tenterhooks after recurring accounts of encounters and sightings of the odd, hairy hominid. Article courtesy Alejandro J. Cordoba, A.R. Copyright Diario El Tribuno, Salta, Argentina. This is the end of story number 2. Story number 3. Bigfoot and Betty Allen, by Don Davis, copyright 2002. The headlines of the small November 1963 issue of the San Francisco Territorial News screamed, "Story behind the Bigfoot mystery, complete in this issue." Well, how could anyone resist buying that? Especially as it seemed you could unlock the mystery with only a 10-cent purchase. Of course, the fact that the November 1963 edition was on the newspaper rack in the spring of 1964 might discourage some from buying it. The paper didn't unlock the Bigfoot mystery for me, but it was perhaps the best dime I ever spent. It pointed me to the Presidio Branch Library in San Francisco, where an exhibit of Bluff Creek plaster tracks was on display. I had seen photographs prior to that time, but never casts. It also beckoned me irresistibly to the Fisherman's Wharf office of this newspaper, where they had a few copies of Betty Allen's Bigfoot Diary, hot off the press and available for 50 cents each. At that time, I was collecting anything I could find on Bigfoot and related creatures, so this Bigfoot Diary was a priority. Before I go on, please indulge me in a personal flashback. Late 1950s, I was living in New York City. An associate of mine told me one morning that he had seen a special on television the night before about a strange yeti-like creature living in California. Since I was the only person he knew that had spent much time in California, he asked me if I had ever heard of it. At that time, I was firmly convinced of the existence of the yeti in Asia, but had not yet heard mention of the name Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I assured him that any such thing was certainly impossible, but to his credit, I didn't convince him. The special had impressed him enough to leave him with an objective, open mind. I really can't defend the stand I took. In mitigation, perhaps it's to my credit that I did think about what he was saying for a few minutes, and then told him that I believe that the one place in California where such creatures could best exist, if they did exist, would be in the far northwest corner of the state. He said that he thought that was the very area that they were talking about. Around 1960, I moved to San Francisco Bay Area from New York. A year or two later, I came across Sanderson's Abominable Snowman book, which really began my education in cryptozoology. Thus, I was more than ready for and receptive to the November 63 edition of the SF Territorial News. The article in the Territorial News was an account of a visit to Willow Creek for their Bigfoot Days celebration by George Walmsley, publisher of the newspaper. The article included an account of a trip out along the Bluff Creek Road to see Bigfoot tracks. It wasn't long before I was at the newspaper's office on Fisherman's Wharf purchasing a Bigfoot diary and meeting George Walmsley. It turned out that Betty Allen was George Walmsley's aunt and the person that had arranged his Bluff Creek outing. During our conversation that day, I told him I was taking my family on vacation up the California coast and inquired about the possibility of viewing tracks. He encouraged me to contact his aunt and gave me her address in Willow Creek. Up to that time, I had hardly heard of Betty Allen. She is mentioned a couple of times in Sanderson's book, but so casually her name did not stick in my memory. I certainly wasn't aware of the extent of her investigations and her other efforts that were bringing such widespread attention to Bluff Creek. She was about as unknown to me then as she seems to be to many of the Bigfoot investigators and authors of today. I wrote to Betty. There was no reply for a while, Then, just a day or so before heading out, a letter arrived. It was dated July 17th, 1964, and said, in part, "I would be glad to meet with you, and though the news out of the area of Bluff Creek is very sketchy this year, I know earlier the tracks were seen. It would be a very interesting trip for you to take at any rate, and there is a fine camping spot at the Notice Creek Bridge. Workmen are going and coming, but with ordinary caution it is safe enough to drive. Loggers are very polite and careful in this area. I wish I had more recent news and more definite appearances this year, but often I do not hear when they come in, and the men are so busy they pay no attention." Now, Betty told me that at first she tried to discourage people from going to Bluff Creek or anywhere else to search for signs of Bigfoot. She was afraid they would find nothing and spread the word that it was all a hoax. Some insisted on poking around anyway, and in time she came to realize that those that went into the field to search often found nothing. She began encouraging those that wanted to investigate. She told me of 3 general areas that were good places to look for tracks. One was on Notice Creek. I forget if she mentioned the location of a second one, but the one she recommended to me was an area on Bluff Creek near Louse Camp. She didn't tell me where to look, but she did mention things to look for besides tracks. She also told me exactly, to the 10th of a mile, the best place to get down from the road into the steep-sided creek. Among the most interesting parts of my visit was hearing her relate much of the historical Bigfoot investigations and experiences. She talked a bit about searches for Bigfoot evidence, not only in the area of Bluff Creek, but, as she put it, coming in from the other side. Incidentally, it appears the term Bigfoot had been used in the Klamath area by non-Indians for some time before the creature ever made the Eureka newspapers. At the time of my first visit to Willow Creek, and for some time previously, Betty was a string reporter for the Eureka newspaper, gathering news and material from the areas near where she lived. The Yurok and Hoopa Indians had known for a very long time about the strange, hairy man-like giants that they called Oma, my own spelling from verbal coaching of a Yurok friend. Incidentally, it is a Yurok Indian that probably should get credit for the quoted reaction when first informed about the white man's interest in Bigfoot by replying that it was interesting that the white man had finally gotten around to discovering this. There are many accounts from loggers, female cooks at the logging camps, hunters, fishermen, ranchers, and other non-Indians in the area reporting sightings and tracks from long ago. I have seen and heard some of these accounts that go back at least as far as the early 1940s, and I have heard rumors of much earlier incidents. Betty told me about one very old Indian woman she took up to Bluff Creek to see the tracks. This woman carried the very old tattoos on her face that I understand were applied to young children of her tribe in the 1800s. The woman couldn't walk very far, and then only with help. When she saw the tracks, she excitedly exclaimed, "All my life I've heard about these things, and now at last I finally get to see their tracks." In the 1950s, logging operations in Northern California were going full blast. The one best known to Bigfoot buffs is one that was located in the Great V of the Klamath River, where a new road was built paralleling little-known Bluff Creek and stretching back more than 20 miles from the Klamath River. For much of the time, that logging operations and road building were taking place near Bluff Creek, and alongside the Lonesome Ridge, the workers camped out or lived in portable accommodations in the woods. They generally only went home on weekends, leaving their woodsy campsites deserted. It didn't take long before strange, large footprints started appearing, especially where new road gradings had taken place. Soon other incidents began to occur, which have been previously mentioned in various Bigfoot records. Betty told me that the contractor was loath to have any word of these strange happenings reported to the outside world, partly for this reason, and partly not to be accused of being crazy. The workers were reluctant to speak of the strange events that were taking place. Some of the occurrences the workers found very alarming. At home on the weekends, some of the workers would confide their uneasiness to their wives, and in time, some of these wives began to talk to Betty. It is likely that Betty had heard about this Bigfoot creature prior to the time when these wives began to fear for their husband's safety. I do know that at some point Betty began her own investigation of whatever evidence she could uncover that might prove or disprove the existence of Bigfoot. Her efforts eventually convinced her that Bigfoot roamed her area, and his visits were not isolated or just occasional. The reports from workers' wives, coupled with information she obtained by other means, enabled Betty to gather a considerable amount of data. One time she was having dinner in one of the Willow Creek restaurants when she overheard a man at the table behind her talking about huge footprints. He had found these tracks around his snowbound construction equipment out in the woods. He was telling how he had followed the tracks for several miles in the snow, in the dead of winter, before turning back because of a new storm threat. She told me that when she overheard this conversation, she turned around and politely asked a question or two. This led to an evening's dinner where she spent about as much time conversing with the table behind her as with those at her own table. She said that on the restaurant wall near the table was a map of the Klamath area. And this map was used during this conversation to indicate various locations. Some years later, while having dinner in one of the Willow Creek restaurants, I noticed a map on the wall above my table. In looking closely at it, I noticed a circle and several other pencil marks drawn in the upper Bluff Creek area, and I wondered if these marks were added to that map one evening by a contractor and or Betty Allen. I'm not sure that same restaurant is still there, but I do know the map has disappeared. With some of the information she gathered, Betty began a scrapbook. As the reports from loggers' wives and others accumulated, she began to try to interest her editor, Andrew Genzoli, in her material. She wanted to do an article for the Jrdk paper. For some time, Mr. Genzoli expressed no interest in such an article. Finally, after repeated efforts on Betty's part, he stopped putting her off. Betty sent a small sample portion of her material. Then she waited for his response. Some days later, Betty opened the Jrdk paper to see an article Mr. Genzoli had written using some of the material Betty had supplied. His article featured an illustrated cartoon caricature, probably so that no one would accuse the newspaper of seriously believing the Bigfoot material. Betty was disappointed. When she talked with her editor by phone, she learned that he fully expected hoots and ridicule to result from the article's appearance, but decided to publish it anyway. When letters from readers slowly began to arrive, Mr. Genzoli was surprised that instead of ridicule, the writers told personal stories of Bigfoot experiences. Betty was surprised at the extent of the readership reaction. Later, Mr. Genzoli got in touch with Jerry Crew regarding the cast that he had made and wrote a second article. It just might have been Betty Allen that brought Mr. Genzoli and Jerry Crew together, as she was there helping Jerry Crew when he made his first cast. She said she came back the next day to the casting site with her own material and made a cast from the same series of tracks Jerry used. The article featuring Jerry Crew and his cast was the one picked up by the Associated Press wire service that resulted in changing the scope of Bigfoot investigations forever. Betty had not gotten to write her article, but her efforts to collect, examine, and her attempts to publish had launched the modern Bigfoot era. In Canada, John Green and Renee DeHinden read about the Bigfoot in Northern California, and first John and later Renee came to investigate. Tom Slick saw the reports and shifted his attention from the Yeti of Tibet to the Bigfoot of California. Now, Betty didn't seem to have great admiration for Tom Slick's Pacific Northwest expedition. She didn't approve of hunting Bigfoot with guns, especially since so little was known about it. She was relieved when the expedition members left without a Bigfoot specimen. It also may be that she declined to share her information with the Slick expedition. If this is so, it may explain why members of that group have pretty much ignored her contributions to the study of Bigfoot in their writings. In 1958, Ivan Sanderson became aware of reported Bigfoot activity in Northern California. In his book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, Sanderson, on page 129, makes the following statement referring to when he heard about California Bigfoot for the first time. The point I want to make is that this whole bit did sound quite absurd even to us, who became immune to such shocks years ago. It is all very well for abominable creatures to be pounding over snow-covered passes in Nepal and Tibet, but a wild man with a 17-inch foot and a 50-inch stride tromping around California was then a little too much to ask, even for us to stomach. In the foreword to his Abominable Snowman book, Mr. Sanderson also states, 3 years ago, his book was published in 1961, I dismissed all such evidence as either hoax or legend. Of course, that was before his trip to Willow Creek in 1959 and his meetings with Betty Allen. She said Sanderson stayed in a motel in Willow Creek for a week or two while she ran around lining up witness after witness for him to interview. She opened her files to him. She offered to accompany him to Bluff Creek, but he wasn't interested in viewing anything for himself, neither locations nor tracks. By the time Sanderson left, Betty had furnished him with enough material for a book on the Bigfoot of Northern California, which she expected him to write. Instead, he used only a small part, of her material for a chapter or so in his Abominable Snowman book. She was disappointed once again. It should be realized that the Bigfoot incidents in Bluff Creek in the 1950s and 60s were by no means unique. Similar happenings had been known in many places in and outside the United States. Sometimes the occurrences were, and still are, as frequent, if not more so, than Bluff Creek. But thanks to Betty Allen's efforts, it was Bluff Creek that got the big play in the newspapers, thus attracting the attention of many investigators and researchers and eventually Patterson and Gimlin. And Betty lived very modestly when I knew her. She did not even have a car. She enjoyed going out into the field to investigate, but to do this, she had to get someone to take her, as the trip from her home to the prime evidence areas was more than 50 miles over not the best of roads. Al Hodgson, who was later to be involved with the Patterson-Gimlin filming, and who now is doing such a nice job of developing the Bigfoot wing of the museum in Willow Creek, was one of those that accompanied her on trips up Bluff Creek. Today, Willow Creek seems to me to be about the same size as it was in the early 1960s. It is the southern gateway to Bluff Creek area and is the place where the Bigfoot Scenic Highway, State Highway 96, starts and proceeds north towards the creek Betty so loved to visit. The Willow Creek Museum is well worth a visit, as it houses Bob Titmus's Bigfoot cast collection and other interesting material. It is a shame that Betty's material is not there as well. Willow Creek was Betty's hometown until the mid-1960s when she moved to Alaska. She wrote me sometime after the big Alaska earthquake, telling me of information she had received from Ivan Sanderson regarding Bigfoot happenings on the Pacific coast, near where Alaska and Canada meet. I think the idea of searching out Bigfoot in Alaska appealed to her, I was at the dedication of the Bigfoot wing of the Willow Creek Museum in 1999. I had been to the museum once before and have visited several times since. The staff of volunteers is very helpful and polite, but with the exception of Al Hodgson, none that I talked with seemed to have any idea who Betty Allen was. I think it would be nice if her name was on the outside of the museum in big letters, maybe something like the Betty Allen Bigfoot Museum and Research Center. What do you think? There is a copy of Betty Allen's small booklet, Bigfoot Diary, locked up in one of the museum's display cases. Outside of that, she seems pretty much forgotten in her hometown and most everywhere else. Don Davis was involved casually as a witness, investigator, and researcher in the field of cryptozoology since before Bernard Heuvelmans coined the term. The article appearing here is the first draft for a chapter of a book he was preparing about some of his more interesting Bigfoot experiences. Sadly, Don died in February 2002, and this article was his last work to see print. Copyright, published in Craig Heinzelman's Crypto, Hominology Special Number 2, 2002. This ends the third reading. Thank you for listening. Welcome. This collection of 3 stories is being brought to you by William Jevning, and it's being narrated by Jim Sower. These stories come to us from California. The first is Eureka, California, 1896. The second is Sasquatch and the Edwards Air Force Base, and the third, Mysterious Shaver Lake. Story number 1, Eureka, California, 1896. Interesting old story. In 1965, my mother's friend, an old dear from near Sacramento, showed her a letter. It was transcribed by her daughter, who found some of the usage and language amusing, and she presented it to her grammar school class. No one knows where the original is. It was found pressed into the pages of an old dictionary, but has since been lost or misplaced. Enjoy it. If you use it in your publication, please just refer to me as Jack. I enjoy the fruits of your research and wish you many, many years of success in your endeavor. Regards, Jack, Lakota Sioux. Guide, outfitter, guide in our great Northwest. A few weeks back, my friend Jake McCoy and I were in witness to the following of accounts. We were well spent after an uncommon day of awful heat cutting timber. Our days in these woods were usually of a cool and foggy nature, with the heat rarely becoming to our discomfort. After our supper, Jake and I were of a mind to sit by the creek. With the next day being Sunday, we were able to enjoy an evening of our own doings. We were smoking and having coffee when we smelt something like a dead animal left to rot in the heat. I remember once coming upon a shot bear that his hunter could not trail, and it had laid and rotted for 4 days, by my opinion. It gave an awful stench, which would give many a disagreeable stomach. This scent was in similarity to that. We saw nothing out of the expected, but could hear a rustling in the brush just across the creek. Being August, the creek was not more than 4 or 5 goodly strides from this bank across. A man could start to a run and jump fully across it if he were determined of doing so. We saw a large man coming through the trees, and Jake stood up and asked what in creation it was. As I had just been looking towards the sun, my eyes did not give a clear viewing of what it was. I rubbed my eyes to have a look, and I was not in knowledge of what I saw. It appeared to be a bear at first, but we had not seen any bears in this area, and it walked as a man would on its 2 legs. If it was a man, He was covered with a dark hair, and long like the mane of a horse, and it was dark brown in color. Jake yelled out, "Who goes there?" But this man-beast did not make a response. It stopped in its tracks and looked at us from a distance of about 70 paces. We stood, but were froze as we wondered of the type of creature we were in witness to. After just a moment or two, it turned and walked back up the hill in great long strides and with unexpected ease and swiftness. We heard it climb up the hill, and then all was silent. We noticed it walk for 20 or so paces, all of them upright. It had arms like a man's, but of a much bigger size, and greater length than a man's. It must have been of great strength, as we determined it to be greater in height than 7 feet. We said nothing to our supervisors, as loafing and insubordination would get you off and looking for employment in other parts. Too many men wanted too little work, so saying anything that would attract attention to yourself in a manner not deemed proper was not born of a good idea. However, an Indian named Joe, who frequented our camp to vend his wares, had told of a mountain giant uncommon to these woods. I explained what we saw, and he said his people often saw these giants. However, he said that most would see them in late night or darkness. The giants did not care to be seen and were quiet and careful to be hidden. Joe said that he could find tracks all along the creeks and rivers of a morning. I swear the events written here is the truth and happened with us being of a sound mind and in sobriety. L. T. Mills, 19 August of 1896, Eureka, California, as dictated to L. B. Small, Clerk. This ends the reading of the first story. This next story is entitled Sasquatch and the Edwards Air Force Base Surveillance, written by Doug Trapp. The sun dropped quickly behind the desert rock piles, revealing a deep red glow to the western sky, as Corey Rudolph and I made camp at the east end of Avenue J in Palmdale one spring night in 1977. We had been visiting the area as often as possible in response to several credible Bigfoot reports in this California desert. To the east was nothing but dark black sky with thousands of stars and periodic meteors whizzing by. Our objective was twofold. 1, to observe all we could during the night, and 2, to get away from the Los Angeles rat race. We had been driving through the areas north of the mountains, separating the Los Angeles area from the desert, in search of clues and people to interview who claimed to have encountered the desert Sasquatch. Through the next 3 years, Corey and I, and sometimes myself with my faithful red-tailed hawk, Nixon, we gathered as much information on desert Sasquatch activity as we could. In many cases, the witnesses told very similar tales of large, hair-covered, man-like apes observed crossing the highway, or looking in their windows at their homes, usually after midnight. Through these witnesses, we slowly became aware that the military, just north of Lancaster, California, at Edwards Air Force Base, had been witness to these desert man-beasts for several years. We finally made contact with 3 different military security officers, all of which did not know of the others, who provided us with information relating to what the Air Force knew about these animals. Before I continue with this, I must inform the reader that these 3 men were willing to discuss this with us only because we promised to never reveal their names or ranks, and if we did, they would deny everything. Because I believe in keeping promises, I will comply with their request, but will refer to them only by rank, since I do not believe that their status at the time would indicate or reveal their true identity, thereby keeping my promise. I will also add that I have spoken to 5 additional ex-military officers who were once stationed at Edwards Air Force Base, and they all claim that what the first three revealed was accurate, and that not much has changed there since the 1970s. The first I interviewed was a lieutenant in charge of security in the sector of Edwards Air Force Base near Rogers Dry Lake. He was primarily responsible for supervising the surveillance activity from sunset to sundown from 1972 to 1975, when he was then transferred to Germany, then retired. This gentleman explained to me that the base security was primarily involved with monitoring for unauthorized entry to the base by curious seekers. The base was highly involved with classified secret aircraft testing at the time, and there were many curious people trying to take photos or just see these things. In addition, the base had a very high level of UFO activity, or as he put it, alien spacecraft. In fact, he made it clear that these craft were not from Earth, and that the Air Force knew very little about them. When any unauthorized people or alien aircraft entered his perimeter, he was to report it to the higher command and observe. All of his personnel had top security clearance and were to discuss nothing of what they saw. He further described some of these craft to me, but I was not very interested at the time. While they were conducting surveillance one night, always using starlight scopes and motion detectors spread throughout the base, one of the guards reported an infiltration in his perimeter. When asked for details, the guard described a very tall man, but not really a man. Perplexed by such a report, he decided to drive to the location and talk to the guard, perhaps thinking the man had lost his marbles. When he arrived, a wide-eyed guard met him and repeated his story. The lieutenant began to scan the desert for the intruder and soon spied him, or it. Through the starlight scope, he could clearly see that this was not a man. It was a very tall, hair-covered, ape-like man walking through the desert. He said the animal appeared to be looking at the desert floor in search of something. The animal was about 500 yards distant, but the scope was very powerful and tripod-mounted, so it could be observed clearly. Both men continued to observe the animal as it wandered around almost aimlessly. He then reported to his superiors of the activity and was told to keep the animal in sight. This was no problem, as the animal remained in the area. About 5 minutes later, a helicopter was heard approaching the area. Then it was seen coming in fast from the east. They continued to observe the animal, which continued its activity. The helicopter came in over a rock pile, then the animal spooked. It looked at the helicopter, turned, and ran like a deer around a rock pile and out of sight. The helicopter searched the area, but never found the animal. The two men could hardly believe what they had seen. The next day, the lieutenant reported to the command post of the previous night's activity. The command told him that these animals had been seen on the base before, and the public knew them as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The command explained that they were concerned that these animals may be related to the alien craft, and that all such reports must remain top secret. He was told to continue to observe and report, but not to intervene or disturb the animals until the command determined what they were. The lieutenant had heard of Bigfoot before, but not in the desert. He had always thought that this was some sort of fable or hoax. But he knew what he saw, and now knew that they were real. Through the following years, he and his crew observed the Sasquatches on the base several times. By 1975, they had sophisticated equipment, including video surveillance cameras mounted in key areas. He then explained to me that they had videotaped these animals several times, but the tapes were classified and held under top security at all times. By the time he left Edwards, they had learned very little about these creatures, but his feeling was that they were not UFO-related, but biological living beings. The second officer I interviewed was a major before he too retired in 1978. He had served at Edwards Air Force Base from 1970 through 1978 and was in charge of one of the command posts on the north end of the base. He too explained that they were primarily interested in UFOs and aliens. In fact, it was through his words that I first heard the term EBE, which is apparently the military term for aliens or extraterrestrial biological entities. It is only in recent years that this term has been coined in UFO books relating to the military UFO cover-up. In any case, the major confirmed what the lieutenant had told me, but added that these creatures also found their way into the secret underground tunnels that run under Edwards. Although the use and existence of these tunnels was classified, he told me about them knowing that their importance was a moot subject to me. He said that they had surveillance cameras in the tunnels and had, in fact, videotaped the Sasquatches as they wandered through them. He said that they were not concerned with the Sasquatches on the base because they had learned that they were not related to EBE activity, and that they were certain that they were simply undiscovered animals. When I asked why they had not captured or killed one in order to prove the existence to the world, he returned that they could not reveal anything that happened on the base. He said that if they were to admit that these creatures often wandered around on the base, the public would lose confidence in their ability to keep the base secure. This, in turn, would give people the idea that they could do the same. Since there was so much secret work continuing on the base, it was not in their interest to discuss the Sasquatches with the public. They wanted to keep people out, not encourage them to visit in search of Sasquatches. They already had enough problems with UFO seekers, or those wanting to get a peek at the secret aircraft. The third man was a security grunt. That is what he termed himself. He claimed to have seen these desert Sasquatches through starlight scopes on scores of occasions. This man was only about 19 years old, but extremely military in his self-presence. He called me Sir until I asked him not to. He told me that he had seen a couple of Sasquatches that stood over 10 feet high, had seen obvious females, one with a young one walking with her, and once saw a group of 5 Sasquatches walking together, all over 6 feet tall, with the tallest about 8 feet tall. They were fully hair-covered, except the palms of their hands and the base of their feet and their face. He said their face resembled an ape with very small eyes, a flat nose, and ape-like lips. The arms were long and slung down to their knees. He said their feet were like ours, without an arch, as they had tracked them through the desert several times. When I asked him about the surveillance videos, he told me that he knew of them, but was not involved in that. He said only officers were allowed to videotape the creatures or UFOs. Cameras were not allowed on the base in the hands of the grunts. He said that he felt very privileged to have seen these animals with such clarity because he knew there were several like himself that would do anything to see one. However, he suggested that these animals were not as rare as people assumed, but they are very shy and almost strictly nocturnal. They could be photographed, given the right opportunity, but those opportunities were rare because these creatures are very good at remaining concealed, even in the desert. He told me that the reason they were on the base was that they knew that they would not be harmed. He thought that somehow they could feel danger, or even pick up on human thoughts. Since the officers and grunts on Edwards were ordered not to harm or intervene with the creatures, they could feel this vibe and felt protected. Some of these animals, of course, wander around outside of the base, but these animals are always watching their backs, he explained. To conclude this report, I should advise that several sources have told me in recent years that the desert Sasquatches are still being watched at Edwards Air Force Base. In fact, one officer recently told me that the base security actually appreciates the presence of the Sasquatch there, since they give the officers some needed entertainment. Then a question came to mind. Could the EBEs be just as interested in the Sasquatches as they are of other base activities? The officer stopped for a moment, thinking, then said simply, "Perhaps." Written by Douglas E. Trapp, Dallas, Texas. This ends the second reading. This brings us to the last of the three stories. Mysterious Shaver Lake, Fresno County, California. Many sightings, 4 in summer 2012. Additional sightings occurred in September and other updates. Sierra Range, June 2012, around 9 o'clock p.m. Not quite sure how to type this. 9 o'clock p.m., stone sober. While driving, I saw up to my right, illuminated only for a couple seconds, as I was towing downhill in a corner turn doing 15 miles per hour, what I believe to fit all descriptions of a Bigfoot. But as I turned the corner, I lost sight. What I saw with the time that I had was half a stride, pause, look and turn, and beginning to stride away. If it wasn't a Bigfoot, then it was a slim bear striding around on his rear legs with all the dimensions of Bigfoot, or maybe a 7-foot-tall, 400-pound ex-football player playing with scaring people, and he got me for a minute or two. In my mind, a lot taller than a man, and his bulk was proportional to Bigfoot. No way for it to be anything else. I know my shapes. The area was hilly, located at the end of Highway 168, 4-lane highway, next down to 2 lanes, small plateau type, small meadow. Above roadway elevation is 3,000 or so. I notified no rangers. June 24th, 2012. The aforementioned report prompted this response. A woman reported that her daughter's boyfriend had a sighting in the region of Shaver Lake. In part, she reported, he saw the Bigfoot in his headlights, crouched down next to the road. As he hit his brakes and came to almost a full stop, the Bigfoot stood up straight, strolled off, then ran up the hill and into the trees. He had an unobstructed view for about 5 to 10 seconds. He is a mountain resident that has hunted bear and swore unequivocally that it was not a bear or a man in a suit. It was huge, with a huge chest and did not move like a man, and that its strides were very long. I believe that he is telling the truth. He is just not a BS kind of guy that would make this up. His mom reported that he called her almost hysterical over what he saw. Saturday, June 30th, 2012. Carla and Manuel M. filed a report that was not a physical sighting. While honeymooning at a rental cabin on Shaver Lake, California, they heard vocalizations being emitted from one side of the lake to the other. Manny M. wrote that the sounds were whoops like whoop, 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 in a series of 3 sets that started on one side of the lake and then returned whoop, whoop, whoop from the other side of the lake. This went on for several hours after midnight, 3 nights in a row. On their last night there, Carla woke Manny up and ushered him out onto their bedroom porch that was overlooking the lake. The two of them heard a baby crying that lasted 3 or 4 minutes. The sound was that of an infant, and it was a frantic cry, and very loud, echoing across the lake. It also emanated from deep within the forest area on the opposite side of Shaver Lake. As they returned to their bedroom, the whoops started up again. Carla said it was very creepy and that it prevented them from exploring the rocky terrain and much of the lakefront while they honeymooned there. Wednesday, July 11th, 2012. 2 forestry workers for Southern California Edison, the company that owns Shaver Lake, stopped to eat their lunch on the banks of Shaver Lake. As they were getting up to head back to their utility truck, parked on the frontage way of Highway 168, they both stopped cold as a reddish-colored Bigfoot walked out of the trees and into the lake. One of the witnesses who filed the report said his visual was too quick to accurately judge its height, other than to say it was a pretty big fella with a heavy coat of tangled-like-looking hair all over. He said it surfaced and swam toward the eastern side in what looked like a very strong dog paddle kind of stroke. He was really moving. The 2 men stood there dumbfounded as the Bigfoot swam out of sight. Additional sighting, 2009. The SCE informant in the above report said that when he mentioned the sighting to his daughter's music teacher, she related another story told to her that took place also at Shaver Lake in 2009. In any case, it was a second-hand report that told of 3 campers who were driven out of their tents in the middle of the night by a screaming Mimi that unstaked their tents and attempted to drag them off, tent and all, into the night somewhere. They fled for their lives and did report it to forestry the next day. It was also reported on the internet. Not sure where. The informant was asked if he knew what the forestry official did, and he said apparently nothing, and indicated they were either mistaken or it was a bear. The music teacher had said, though, "We know black bears do not behave that way, and we have no grizzlies in California." It leaves one to wonder what there is left in the forest that would rip up the tent stakes and heave tents with people inside around the campsite. Bears just don't behave that way. Of interest in that story was that the campers kept a high campfire going at night, and that the fire did not deter the attack by the Sasquatches. The music teacher said there were 2 of them, maybe even a third, but nobody stuck around to find out. This isn't the first recording of a campsite attack. The other was in Colorado in the San Juan Mountains. But around Shaver Lake and nearby communities, everyone has a story to tell about Bigfoot. Shaver Lake history surrounding areas. The cast of Finding Bigfoot television series was in Shaver Lake in March of 2012, interviewing witnesses in a town hall meeting event. At that meeting, Ken Gentry said his group had a huge rock hurled at them from 300 feet away, on the top of a ridge, and saw it as it was launched. They were hiking near 3 rivers, not far from Shaver Lake area. It was a very large rock. One of the athletic guys on our crew, Billy, picked it up and tried to throw it, but he couldn't throw it even 25 feet. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have had a hard time believing it actually happened, Gentry said. October 2012. 3 middle-aged men go missing near Shaver Lake region. A backpacker, his car was found near Shaver Lake, and a second hiker went missing in the general area of the Sierra National Park, where there were 3 or more separate Bigfoot sightings summer of 2012. 2 hikers were found, but Larry Kahn, 53, is still missing, 11/6/12. Another sighting contains a lengthy bunch of extraneous information about the surroundings and little about 3 large cinnamon brown humanoid figures that moved through a stand of spruce trees. The nearest town? Shaver Lake. Shaver Lake Small Town Magazine filed this article written by Jolene Polyak in the fall of 2012. Jolene attended the Shaver Lake Town Hall meeting. Southeast of Shaver Lake is great deer hunting, according to Bruce Dakova, 51, and his hunting partner, Samuel Broderick, 46, from out of state. It is an area south of Huntington Lake, just short of Dinky Creek, off to the eastern rim of Shaver Lake. In late 2009, the two men went looking for a prime place to set up for the hunting season. In the process, Broderick was taking an armload of firewood to the nearby fire pit when he noticed not one but two dark figures in the trees. He continued toward the fire ring, dumped the firewood, and put his hand on Dakova's shoulder, whispering to him not to be obvious but to look in that direction when he could. He whispered that they were being watched by what he thought might be a couple of Bigfoot. Dakova, a veteran trophy hunter, had heard such stories but thought Bigfoot was imagined. He went about setting up their tent and then cleaned off his Ray-Ban sunglasses so he could look around without his eyes giving him away. Sure enough, there were two very tall individuals watching them, not 35 feet from where he was staking the tent. The pounding of the stakes echoed in the trees, but there were no other sounds to be heard. The Bigfoot made no noise. Dakova turned at that point and told Broderick that he also could see them and was amazed. To break the tension, Dakova yelled over to Broderick, "Do they understand English?" Broderick broke into a nervous laughter like, and began nervously singing the state fight song. Dakova joined in as they edged toward the rifles laying on the ground. For his part, Broderick was admittedly nervous and hurriedly reached down to unzip the cover off his rifle and loaded it just in case the two creatures came into camp. Apparently, when Broderick raised up the rifle to load it, both Sasquatch departed. The two hunters told me they did not see the creatures again or notice anything unusual during the night. There were no screams and no rock throwing, and none of the usual nighttime Bigfoot antics reported by other hunters. The description of the two Bigfoot was minimal. They were in the 8-foot range, according to the height of the trees where they stood, and dark in color. Otherwise, no additional details were given. Rob Janis. The behavior of the Shaver Lake Dinky Creek watchers was decidedly different from most reports from hunters, in that the two Sasquatch apparently knew what the rifle meant, even though the two hunters did not acknowledge their presence. There are reports of vocalizations in that region, and a number of recent sightings of varying color description, making Janis conclude that there might be a diverse population in that region. Janis also noted in his report that neither Broderick nor Dakova bagged a deer that trip. In fact, Broderick said he never spotted one, and even that was unusual. Update, December 29, 2012. Mosmanko 253 wrote December 28, 2012, that he and his girlfriend were riding around looking at property in the Shaver Lake area when they decided to pull over and break out sandwiches at the dead end of Dorabella Road. He looked up as the woman with him cried out, "Look, look!" and saw a very strange sight. Heading back into the far side of the trees was a man in a furry costume. He didn't report it because he thought it was a joke until he read this page and decided to report it as a possible Bigfoot sighting that occurred on September 15, 2012. In hindsight, the witness said what he thought was a man in a costume was much too tall to be a joke. This was about 12:30 on Saturday afternoon. We were parked, eating chicken sandwiches and sharing a Diet Pepsi when this happened. My lady friend didn't think it was a costume, but some kind of creature, because the furry part was reddish and long fur down his back and not like a hooded costume. If this was a Bigfoot the couple saw, it brings the sighting total around Shaver Lake to 5 in 2012. Update. Shaver Lake missing hiker Larry Kahn, a Los Angeles-based attorney who worked at Posnelli Shugart, has not been found as of this date, March 31st, 2013. The search for the resident of Pacific Palisades was suspended in November 2012, after no trace of the man was found other than his car. Update. Hiker Matthew Hansen has been found, but no details. A report came in January 2013, but the sighting took place back in 1998. A cabin owner near Shaver Lake, California, reported hearing a pack of coyotes yipping and chirping away at something. Walking over to his window, he saw a Bigfoot carrying some kind of large feathered bird in its hand, walking up the road towards his place on Sweetgrass Road. The coyotes were jumping up, trying to bite whatever it was the creature was carrying. He called to his wife and son, and they also saw it as it walked off through the trees down a dirt trail, which was later paved. R.C. 1998. This concludes the reading of the 3 stories. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out